Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hi, Con.
Hey.
How's life
going?
at Deluxe?
Good.
Good. All right. So, why don't you tell us quickly about what's Deluxe One?
Sure. So basically, Deluxe is, and you sort of need a bigger story to this, right? So Deluxe has been around just over a century, right? And that's all the way from film lab production to film production to digital distribution, etc. And if you look at Deluxe, currently there are two facets to it, right? So one is the creative side of the business, and the other one is the aggregation and distribution side of the business. So Deluxe One basically brings a lot of the what were bespoke projects. So we had some things in cloud infrastructure footprint. We had some things that were entirely on-prem, and the size of these range, right? So we have some customers we service where we have 8 to 10 petabytes of online storage. That's a challenge to move that, right? But if you look at the combination of this, right, when it comes time to say make a change to integrate all of these different bespoke services, our path has been to shift this all onto AWS, retool, re-architect, and then from the slide here you can basically see this covers a whole bunch of different facets for Deluxe. So everything from localization, workforce around that, theatrical distribution, digital distribution, content supply chain, and all the other pieces that go with that.
So, can you kind of give us a view of the type of supply chain workflow that you have? Because I've heard there's a lot of obviously complexity, and given that you are touching so many different facets of the media workflow, right? I'm curious to kind of see how you, like, what's the actual problem that you're trying to address?
Yeah, so, and it goes back to the previous points that we talked about. So it sort of helps to also break that down, right? So there's a lot of content we're dealing with in terms of migration. Some of it is tape-based. We have on-prem object store-based. We also have block store-based. But that majority of data is 9,000 tapes that we have to basically migrate to cloud, right? So on the one hand, you have this application tier that has to get built, and we're doing that all as microservices, so 100% cloud native. Everything there can only talk to object storage. We give no options for things like, well, I need block storage to make application X, Y, or Z work. So we're trying to push it 100% cloud native, right? So that equates to about 50 plus microservices. We have multiple environments that these run inside of, and then pipelined workflows across those services. So ingest, aggregation, processing, all the way to distribution of content to endpoints.
Cool. So what kind of role does machine learning play in this?
So yeah, it sort of speaks a little bit to this slide as well, right? Where on the left you can see there's this, in the past we had all these bespoke systems and communication buses that were, if you looked at each system, potentially you'd have multiple lines of business, each one would have multiple products, and people would be standing up all these product lines independently in silos. But the move there, and getting to a point, the move there obviously through one is to consolidate all of this, right? And once we start consolidating things like storage, etc., then we're met with, these business challenges, right? So the amount of data that we process per week, the amount of data that we egress for distribution. So we do about 4.5 to 6 petabytes of data for distribution delivery every month. And then things like SLA, right? So if you look at the amount of data flowing through the system and you look at the amount of people that have to basically touch that from an on-prem footprint, things like transcode workflows, etc., machine learning is something naturally where you look at that and you go, we've optimized, say, the cloud footprint and the infrastructure. How further can we optimize like the touch points for, say, people actually interacting with the system?
So basically, to kind of summarize, you're using machine learning for not just gathering data or metadata around different objects, but also operational aspects and making your operational aspects of your supply chain optimized with the help of machine learning.
Correct, yeah. So there's, especially with the kinds of assets we deal with, where a lot of it is, it already comes in with sidecar metadata that already has things like genres, descriptions, actors, etc. We're not really processing these files from that perspective of can I find labels, detected within, say, the video or the images, etc. It's more around value like on the supply chain side, being able to do things like automated conformance without a person having to load it into an edit bay. So we do that right now. And then matching of assets. So obviously when you're dealing with this amount of scale of assets landing, you can't have a person look at things like file names, right? So we have all these content bins with assets flowing into it, and we fingerprint them. Some of this is a math problem, some of it is a machine learning problem. In many cases, it's actually better solved by pure math and pixel analysis than machine learning. But that's the challenge there, right? Using those kinds of processes to make the pipeline faster and reduce things like SLA.
So would you say machine learning is the next end-all, be-all? Are we going to lose our jobs?
No, I don't think so. Or maybe some people will, like service sector, right? So if it's things like automated, driving and so forth, that's a different problem, a different vertical. But at least from our perspective, there's no value gained by people spending a lot of time processing content manually when we need to automate it.
So maybe can you talk about what role the data actually plays, or I think more importantly, how are you structuring your data, which is operational data in addition to your metadata and machine learning data? I mean, is there any kind of, say, architectural pattern perhaps you could talk about in terms of, kind of aggregating or marrying the data with your content that you guys are leveraging in this complex workflow?
Yeah, so like some of the things that we're looking at now, and the previous speaker talked about things like optimizing workflow for instance sizes. We have, along those veins, we have a different sort of topology or architecture where everything is container-based. So microservices will scale up on EC2 spot fleets as required. It's not really something where we have to estimate capacity, but we just have to scale and then be able to provide capacity, if you will. But some of the things that we're looking at, is from an operational point of view, can we forecast when we need to scale up? And this sort of gets into other aspects, right? If you look at something like Glacier, if I need to pull a lot of content back really fast, and I need to do, say, next day delivery on a lot of content, we have like, I think one of the stats that I got was a couple of years ago, someone pulled back all of the Gunsmoke episodes, and there was, however many, 700 something episodes, right? So being able to do something like that where you have that amount of, say, heavy assets, and then you also have a whole amount of sidecar, metadata, subtitle, and other assets, potentially outputs as well, being able to predictively estimate when you need to pull content back to fulfill an order. This is something where, predictive analysis and machine learning, I think, can help us.
Very cool. Let's talk about some of the challenges. What would you say is, I don't know, perhaps a list of or any business challenges that you want to talk about that would have been hard to overcome or implement with your migration to the cloud?
Yeah, I think one thing that helped, I talked about it earlier, was just embracing S3 for storage and Glacier for archive, and basically not giving an inch on trying to replicate what had been done on-prem in the cloud. So we have some systems that we're moving now, and we've sort of taken this approach of, in some cases, in order to pull a line of business into cloud, we almost have to stage that and then migrate the workflow, right? So it's a partial migration through lift and shift, and then a full migration. But there are challenges with that, right? The one is getting the engineers that work on that code base to rethink about how to solve the problem. Because often we see if you just lift and shift the architecture in, people have expectations for things like latency, performance, I/O, which don't map to...
You're getting into the technical territory.
Yeah, exactly. Which don't map to, from being able to fulfill, say, the business perspective from the technical inputs, right?
So what would you say in terms of, some of the things like when you're going in front of your business, hey, I'm going to migrate this workflow in the cloud. Well, guess what? It's a supply chain. Everything is distribution. It's coming out of the cloud. And there comes, oh, wow, there's going to be a lot of egress. Have you had those conversations? What is your point of view? How do you guys manage, the egress cost, or in general, the TCO, when you compare it to the cloud versus doing stuff online, on-prem rather?
Yeah, so I mean, the one aspect is tackling the TCO as part, or the cost of moving the content from, what's the core thing that I need to deliver? And for us, it's the cost of goods to deliver, say, an asset to a distribution endpoint. And that's after you take out all the other aspects, like what's my cost to, say, move it through a Spera or Signient, or other vendor influenced angles on this problem, right? But if you calculate the cost of goods as landing the asset, storing the asset, archiving it, and then doing N amount of deliveries from that, that's an important point from that perspective, right?
So, I mean, it seems a bit complex, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's complex, but from our perspective, we broke it down. At least, like I was talking about there, we had a lot of different lines of business, and we still do, that are bringing their workloads and then integrating with one as it expands to offer new functionality. But the challenge there is taking each one of those by itself, building a full budget around with it, reviewing the architecture for that, and then, like I said before, giving them a path to lift and shift, retool, and then integrate and migrate. I think if you try and tackle that as like everything absolutely has to be here immediately, then that's where you get complexity and failure.
What are some of the things you would say you would want others to kind of think about when doing this sort of, say, analysis? I mean, obviously it's complex, so one thing is that, look at different businesses, different projects, and kind of assess it in each kind of way, right? But also at the same time, you have to look at, well, what's my budget or annual, portfolio like, for the entire company? What would be some of the things you would tell the audience here to kind of keep into perspective when doing this TCO type of assessment, whether that is for storage or the entire workflow end to end? I don't know if there is two or three kind of words of wisdom here, or points you could talk about.
Yeah, I'd say that the main thing, and what I've run into as well, not only at Deluxe, but also, from AWS and before that, as people often look at the problem of TCO, and they either don't immediately tackle it the correct way, or potentially they just look at one aspect, like the cost of the MSRP cost of S3, and do a one-to-one equation, and then arrive at this isn't going to work because it costs me X to put these Y things on it, right? Mm-hmm. But I think especially and this slide speaks to a lot of that, right? The notion here is that you have a central archive, and that central archive, from perspective, at least from our workloads, is as these assets are landing, they're staged hot before they go into storage, right? There's no cost for me to process that with EC2, though there's cost for EC2, right? But in the same region, I can pull that content, I can create a proxy, and I can proactively, as content is landing, start processing this. So start doing machine learning algorithms, generating proxies, doing all of these bespoke things with the content that usually aren't factored into that TCO. So what I've seen, at least from my experience, here with all of our other lines of businesses, lifting onto the cloud, is that is largely negated or downplayed, and essentially it comes down to the cost of goods is not accurately budgeted for or calculated based on the fact that you have all of these other things available to you, right? So it could be, your data center ping power pop, right? People don't take that into account often. It could be other managed services that potentially you have engineering on now. There are a lot of other facets that aren't, from the onset put into that calculation.
Makes sense. So what would you say from a perspective of, aside from TCO, some of the other issues or challenges you run into, things like security, governance of the content? Obviously, you are touching some very high valued content.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, right? So part of the challenge for us was obviously lift and shift and build a platform and then basically retool everything and get rid of the legacy, right? So that's an on-prem migration problem and an asset migration problem. And that's still ongoing. We land about 500 terabytes to a couple petabytes every month, 24/7 that content is flowing in. So yeah, I mean, that's a hard one. Yeah, it's not an easy one.
So I guess what do you do from a specifically governance perspective, right? Like, do you have any specific roles, access policies in place, different accounts, for example?
We do. So one thing that we looked at was we could either look at this from like a partner, pattern, right, and basically farm out the work to partners. Or we could use just 100% native AWS managed services. So we decided to go the other route, and part of that is because when we started, basically this build and this onboard and migration, Deluxe already had 100 accounts. So, and those are all bespoke, right? So it's a challenge not only in the migration, but also, resetting all of the governance. So we put together a group of people from enterprise IT, from DevOps, from multiple teams, digital cinema, my team, et cetera. And that's sort of our cloud oversight, committee, if you will. So anyone that had accounts, we basically put a new master account structure in place with master account governance, and then pushed it down to all the member accounts. And the approach there is you sort of have to put it in place and wait for people to go, my thing isn't working, what do I do? Here's the right way to do it. So it's too big of a challenge to try and reset that switch for everyone at the same time. So centralized governance and AWS, managed services, that's what we're going for now.
Great. So along those same lines, how do you make this shift in your people culture or company culture, right? Because it's quite a bit of a difference in terms of, hey, I've got this isolated environment on-prem that I have a bunch of people working on versus everything is in the cloud and there's this centralized governance model that you're talking about. Then there is obviously lift and shift. You're going to talk about technical debt and modernizing that. So what would you like to tell the audience about what are some of the things that you're doing or have in place with respect to modernizing this workforce?
Yeah, so for one thing, we've stipulated, and we originally started with, some of the components were designed to try and be multi-cloud, right? So let's design a system that, what are the core components? We're going to use containers. We currently use a HashiCorp stack, so Nomad, Console, etc. We still use that. But a lot of the other design patterns that were in place were traditional distributed computing design patterns, right? So defer computation, make use of queues, but make them cloud agnostic, right? And a lot of the approaches were, let's build a tool to do this and run in a container on this cluster versus using a managed service. And that's a huge mistake, right? Because if you take the multi-cloud approach to a problem of this size, you essentially end up with like communism, right? Yeah. So no one benefits and there's anarchy in the end, right? So especially with microservices, right? So the one thing we did is everything from platform down is a separate team from everything from applications up. So at least from my team's perspective, we control the platform and we provide a service for the application developers and teams using whatever language they want to deploy on top of that. But we tightly control that tier at the bottom, right?
Very cool. So that's almost like decoupling your teams.
Yes.
Awesome. Hey, I coined a new term here. So let's talk about, obviously this industry is evolving quite a bit, and there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions that you're seeing that's changing the entire media and entertainment industry landscape, right? What, in your opinion, is this next think big that you see as from a technical perspective when it comes to media supply chain type of solutions?
Yeah, I mean, technical perspective is probably very different from business perspective, but
you pick.
one of the things, like for me at least, that I see is the amount of data egress we do. So all of those petabytes we move per month, we move that through UDP accelerators and third parties, etc. And really, we're essentially doing a bucket-to-bucket copy of content, right? So we're seeing now, and I'm hoping it goes the same route, is that in many cases, we'll start to do, say, onboarding and integration for supply chain with a distribution endpoint or a source studio, right? And they'll initially come with the regular set of tools that we've seen for the last 10, 15 years. But invariably, someone on the tech team will go, can't I just have this copied to my bucket over here? So we've sort of started to streamline that. And there is some challenge with that, but I think we've solved it a pretty nice way. So we basically use the notion of cross-account roles, and we send SNS notifications. Customer controls the topic, right, or sender controls the source. And then we allow them to pull the content with a cross-account role, where that means key rotation, service integration. There's not us on the one side asking someone to rotate keys, right? So they can put that in a secrets vault if they want. But that back and forth is I'd say it's a lot more streamlined than traditional supply chain has had in the past.
Awesome. So from your perspective, turn this on. All right. So from your perspective, you're saying that it is quite possible today to have this kind of, say, inter-cloud or within the cloud migration of the content without having to move back and forth.
Yeah. And I also need to touch on one other thing, right? So we use obviously S3 Glacier, et cetera, like many other people here, right? But the one thing we did see is that we always have these requirements from customers. We can't control where the content comes from and where it needs to go to, right? So we built an overlay file system on top of that, or on top of the S3 Glacier tiering, and actually the microservices are forced to use this as well. No microservice can talk directly to archive or storage. They all go through VFS. What VFS is able to do is it's able to abstract away things like, my source is on Azure Blob Storage. A service can ask for that to be ingested from that location. And then we take the credentials for all these different services that are provided to us and store that inside a key vault. So the service unseals, sight unseen, gets access to that, and then the data moves. So I think that's key, right? Having a secure key vault, if you're using microservices, having them being able to transparently unseal and gain access to their secrets, and then potentially move the content as well without the pipeline services having any visibility into even the names of the files or where they're coming from.
That's awesome. You should consider writing a white paper on it,
okay,
on this architecture. What's next for Deluxe in this cloud age?
So from Deluxe One perspective, the direction is to productize everything, to bring customers on board, and that could be partners, competitors, etc. So from things like cloud editing or VFX artists, marketplace, those kinds of areas. But then also extending Deluxe One beyond just servicing traditional M&E from that supply chain perspective.
Very cool. So given we're at the end of our allocated time, if you want to take a couple of minutes here and what would be the sort of say key takeaway here for the audience? If you were to summarize our discussion here, or I don't know if there's anything else that you wanna make sure that people understood here, or key takeaway, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think, and from this slide here, right, that there are a couple. This sort of speaks to the way we tackled implementing Deluxe One as well as onboarding, right? So at first we started with, what's the low-hanging fruit, if you will. So the pipeline, onboarding, archive availability, and then obviously the first goal is get transcoding and packaging working, right? So even if some of it has to be fulfilled by on-prem, in other words, there's a loop for packaging, or someone has to look at a spec before pushing it on, because there's not a microservice that can do that yet. That's sort of how we solved that problem. And then you can see, as obviously as we got these things in place and the services started expanding, then those same people that worked on that, because we took that approach, were able to get matrixed into working on other problems. So the more complex problems, like how do we do next day air, how do we pull stuff out of, say expedited with only so many provision capacity units and all this amount of volume, how do we do that for next day, right? How do we do complex packaging where we have multiple inputs, we may have machine learning, et cetera. But essentially that's the path on the bottom there. And the important pieces here, throughout this whole process, we're still looking at innovation, right? So in other words, can we optimize part of these workflows? Can we actually start deleting code and simplifying things? Because then that starts to better the security posture, right? So there's a lot of that ongoing, as well as things like asset migration. And then right to the other side, right, maybe modernizing ingest and delivery like we talked about, and then more easily facilitating these much larger files, 500 gigabytes up for things like UHD.
Well, thank you very much for the time, Con. And thank you very much to the audience for spending the time listening to us. Hopefully this was interesting. If you have any questions, both Con and I will be here outside. We want to give or vacate the stage here for the next presenter. Thanks.